The congressional hearing on voting rights bills was going through the usual partisan back and forth until a comment about voter ID by former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi made Representative Jasmine Crockett visibly tense up in her chair. What came next in the following 2 minutes left the whole chamber in awe and could potentially reframe the way Americans debate voting rights forever. No one anticipated anything out of the ordinary that morning in room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building. The Judiciary Committee hearing room was charged with the customary tension of high-profile testimony. Representatives seated along the curved dais, staffers sharing secrets with their principals, reporters staked out strategically to capture emotion. C-SPAN cameras swept slowly over the scene, recording what most onlookers anticipated would be another predictable partisan exercise. Bondi, who testified as an expert on election integrity procedures, had taken the first hour explaining and defending more stringent voter identification rules and brushing aside complaints that they disproportionately affect minority groups. Her expert testimony was confident and smooth, making use of her background as Florida's erstwhile chief law enforcer. The idea that demanding proof of identity at the polls somehow depresses minority voting is simply not borne out by the fact. Bondi declared firmly, "These communities are quite capable of getting identification, and to imply otherwise seems to me its own brand of soft bigotry." Assuming that some groups can't do something that others do on a regular basis, the camera picked up Representative Crockett's face transition from professional interest to concentrated intensity. As a former civil rights lawyer prior to arriving in Congress, Crockett had been well versed in the actual practice of voting laws in America's communities. When her time came to question, Crockett started out in unanticipated tranquility. "Miss Bondi, I'd like to press you on your comment regarding the simplicity of gaining identification, but first, I do have one question regarding your own experience with identification requirements." Bondi nodded firmly. "Of course, Congresswoman." What followed was an audible response around the hearing room, left Bondi at a loss for words for a fleeting moment, and turned what had previously been boilerplate testimony into a moment to be dissected across all the major news stations for weeks. If you are watching this standoff play out on television for the first time, be sure to subscribe and like as we analyze exactly how Representative Crockett gave a response so profound that it fundamentally reordered the national discourse around voting rights. Pam Bondi had established herself as a hardline prosecutor before being elected to serve 2 terms as Attorney General of Florida. Famous for her sleek television performances and assertive mode of speaking, she had emerged as a leading voice among conservative attorneys. Her appearances before congressional committees were a routine drill, one in which she generally dictated the terms by forceful declaration and selective use of statistics that backed her up. Throughout her term, Bondi had taken a stance as a guardian of election integrity, promoting measures such as draconian voter ID mandate and brushing aside worries about their potential effects on already disenfranchised communities. Her position always prioritized security over access, stating that disenfranchisement concerns were overstated or politically motivated. Representative Jasmine Crockett approached the hearing with a very different viewpoint. Before entering Congress, she had worked as a civil rights attorney in Texas, representing clients directly impacted by voting restriction. Her legal career included successfully challenging voting barriers in court, giving her first-hand knowledge of how seemingly neutral requirements could create substantial obstacles for certain communities. What few analysts seemed to understand was that Crockett's professional experience as a lawyer prepared her to test Bondi's testimony, not with ideological soundbites, but with particular fact and experiential knowledge. While other members of the committee had come at questioning through frames of ideology, Crockett had sat through the morning listening attentively, marking particular assertions which could be tested substantively. The stakes of this test went far wider than the hearing room. The bill on the table would create federal voting access standards, possibly preempting state-level restrictions that had spread in recent years. Defenders insisted on these as necessary safeguards of democratic rights. Critics branded them as federal intrusion into states' affairs that would compromise election security. Public opinion was still split largely along party lines. AI division supported by how the issue was usually framed in media reporting and congressional hearings. These discussions often relied on abstract principles rather than concrete reality, making it difficult for many Americans to evaluate competing claims about the actual impact of voting requirements. This tension provided the ideal setting for the showdown about to ensue. Bondi had introduced voter ID mandates as easy common-sense measures that by their nature couldn't possibly inconvenience eligible voters. Ballots, Dios salve con of interi, for toad to abintenobres nuo. Crockett was the only one who could dispute this depiction, not ideologically but by virtue of certain documented fact. Miss Bondi, Crockett started, you've testified that getting identification is a process that any qualified voter should be able to accomplish without hassle. Before we get to that assertion, I'd like to inquire about your own experience with identification system. Bondi nodded reassuringly, obviously anticipating a familiar line of queries regarding her professional life or political philosophy, the sort of questions she had answered many times before. Something other than that, though, was what she failed to anticipate, the carefully crafted question that would shift the whole hearing. Miss Bondi Crockett went on. Have you ever yourself had your voter registration rejected or placed on hold because of an identification discrepancy? The question was innocuous enough, but packed a hidden trap. If Bondi replied no, she would be admitting to her own lack of personal experience with the very obstacles she was downplaying as not being important. If she said yes, she would be going against her previous witness statement regarding how easy it was to get through identification requirements. No, I haven't. Bondi answered assertively. I've always made sure my registration and identification are in good standing. Crockett nodded. And approximately how long would you estimate it took you to obtain your current driver's license or state ID, including the time to gather required documents, travel to the facility, wait in line, and complete the process? Bondi shrugged slightly. Perhaps an hour or two, not counting gathering documents which most people already have. It's a routine process. Thank you, Crockett said, her tone remaining measured. Now, I'd like to show you some evidence that's in stark contrast to your description of this process as quick and routine for every American. She gestured to a committee aide who handed out documents to other members while showing a map on the big screen behind the Ds. The map indicated counties throughout America with color coding representing distance to the nearest ID issuing office. This Department of Transportation data indicates that in 2023, about 3.2 million Americans reside in counties with no single office that issues government photo ID. Crockett said, in these communities, residents must travel to another county to obtain the identification your preferred policies would require to vote. The camera captured Bondi's face, a subtle change from confidence to caution as she realized the discussion was getting into ground covered by concrete data as opposed to broad principles. Furthermore, Crockett went on, 25% of these ID issuing offices are open fewer than 5 days a week, and 10% are open only 1 or 2 days a month. Many don't provide weekend or evening hours, imposing huge obstacles for hourly workers who can't spare time off. She shifted to another document. This report from the Brennan Center documents the fact that securing underlying documents to obtain ID isn't merely a matter of pulling papers out of a drawer as you implied. A certified birth certificate can cost between $15 and $45. For Americans living paycheck to paycheck, that is a direct financial obstacle to voting, effectively acting as a modern poll tax. The room had fallen noticeably quieter as Crockett methodically laid out evidence countering Bondi's description of voter ID requirements as quick procedural steps that couldn't possibly influence eligible voters. Bondi, regaining her composure, responded, "These are exceptional cases, Congresswoman. For the vast majority of Americans, getting ID is easy. We can't construct our whole electoral process based on edge cases." It was precisely the opening Crockett had hoped for. Miss Bondi, would 21 million American citizens qualify as an edge case? Before Bondi had a chance to reply, Crockett went on, because that's the number of eligible voters who don't have government-issued photo ID, based on studies by the Brennan Center and a study conducted by the University of Wisconsin. That's roughly 11% of eligible voters. She paused to allow the figure to sink into the committee and listeners. To place that in context, the winning margin in 3 of the most recent 6 presidential elections was below 3% of the vote. These are not corner cases. They are millions of eligible American voters who would have more hurdles to clear under the policies you're espousing. Bondi, visibly recalibrating her strategy, retorted Congresswoman. I know those studies, and they've been faulted for methodological shortcomings. Other studies indicate the figure is much smaller, and in any case, states that do have ID requirements usually have provisions for those who might struggle to obtain regular identification. I'm happy you mentioned those provisions, Crockett said, her voice showing that Bondi had strolled in another well-laid trap. Because here I have the actual application forms for gaining free voter ID in the 5 states with the highest requirement. She waved a considerable stack of papers. The typical length of these applications is 9 pages. They ask for several forms of documentation that many Americans, especially older, poor, and minority voters, disproportionately do not. In Texas, for example, my home state, a voter without necessary underlying documents must fill out a 2-page request for identification verification that may take several weeks to complete, longer than the interval between election deadlines and election. The conversation had transformed completely away from intangible principles to concrete documentation of how ID mandates operated in practice. Committee members who had been looking at phones or studying notes were now completely absorbed, realizing that something meaningful was going on, instead of the usual partisan show. Bondi, sensing the discussion had transcended talking points to actual facts, tried to change course. Its course, Congresswoman, much as I appreciate your concern about these voters, we have to weigh access against security. Even a single phony vote erodes trust in our election. Crockett nodded. I certainly agree that security is important, which is why I've put together this last piece of evidence that I think the whole committee ought to take serious. She pulled out a final document from her portfolio. This is the comprehensive data on documented cases of in-person voter impersonation fraud, the AD-only type of fraud that strict ID requirements would prevent over the past 20 years across all 50 states. This data comes directly from state attorneys' general offices, court records, and the Heritage Foundation's own voter fraud database. The screen behind her displayed a simple chart showing years on one axis and fraud cases on another. The numbers were strikingly small. Over 2 decades and more than 2 billion votes cast, there have been exactly 31 documented cases of in-person voter impersonation nationwide. Crockett stated clearly, not 31,000 or 31 million, 31 total cases. That's a fraud rate of 0%. She paused for a moment to let the statistic linger before going on. To put this in perspective, Americans are more likely to be hit by lightning than to face in-person voter fraud. But the solution being offered would stand in the way of 21 million eligible voters in an attempt to stop what is statistically a non-existent problem. Crockett addressed Bondi directly, his face serious but not unfriendly. Miss Bondi, you previously indicated that the assumption that certain communities would have an issue with ID requirements is some sort of soft bigotry. I need to respond to that accusation directly. The room was absolutely silent. The usual background paper shuffling and sidelong whispering side conversations completely silent. That which you have defined as soft bigotry is itself recorded fact, replied Crockett, her tone measured but bearing unequivocal moral authority. When I was a civil rights lawyer in Texas, I defended clients such as Mrs. Esther Johnson, an 86-year-old black woman who had voted in every election since the Voting Rights Act became law in 1965. When Texas enforced its stringent ID law, her voter registration was challenged because the spelling of her birth certificate name, on which she had been born back in 1930s segregated Texas to a midwife, differed from that of her married name on all her other IDs. Crockett went on, it took Mrs. Johnson 7 months, 4 trips to government office, $147 in fees to replace documents, and finally legal action to regain her right to vote. She was not lacking ability or intelligence. She was dealing with a system that put disproportionate burdens on some communities, especially older voters of color, who were born when official records for Black Americans were often erratic or intentionally ignored. The camera captured Bondi's look, confidence that had marked her earlier testimony now being replaced with something akin to sincere consideration. This was not partisan spectacle, but concrete evidence contrary to her construction of the problem. The issue before us is not whether voters are able, Crockett began, leading to her key point. It's whether we're consciously designing systems that impose greater burdens on some potential voters than on others, aware that those burdens disproportionately fall on certain groups, and whether we're doing it to avoid a problem the evidence literally indicates barely exists. She closed her portfolio intentionally. That's not soft bigotry or partisan gain. It's about whether we truly believe in equal access to the ballot for every eligible American citizen, regardless of their circumstances. Because the evidence I've presented today makes one thing clear. The current patchwork of voter ID laws across America is failing that fundamental test. The impact of Crockett's presentation was immediate and visible. Committee members from both sides were reading over the documents she had given them, some of which were having quiet, serious discussions with aides, even representatives who had walked in. The hearing with hard-set positions seemed to be digesting the particular evidence that had been laid out before them. The committee chairman, acknowledging the gravity of the moment, addressed Bondi. "Miss Bondi, would you care to reply to Representative Crockett's evidence?" Bondi hesitated, obviously retuning her strategy in response to the particular documentation that had been offered. Her response would take spectators on both sides of politics aback. "Congresswoman Crockett has made valid arguments worthy of careful consideration," Bondi her demeanor considerably altered from her previous testimony. "Although I believe election security practices are appropriate, the particular evidence about how unusually rare in-person fraud is, and about how there is evidence to document actual impediments to qualified voters calls for a more subtle approach than most states have taken." She went on, "My worry has always been about election integrity, but that integrity is compromised keeps legitimate voters out. Maybe there can be solutions that balance security and accessibility better than the present hodgepodge of state codes." It wasn't a reversal of stance, but it was an indication of something unusual in congressional hearings, an acceptance that certain evidence had raised legitimate concerns that cut across party positioning. The openness to dealing with evidence instead of pushing it aside along party line was a big break with how voting rights had usually been handled in such setting. Within a matter of hours of the encounter, clips started going viral on social media and news outlets. What made the confrontation so engrossing was not partisan gotcha moment, but the substance of the evidence Crockett had raised and Bondi's surprise acknowledgement of its credibility. The hashtag #VotingRealitiesVille myths started trending as people posted the numerical comparison of the 21 million voters who might be impacted by hard ID laws and the 31 instances of fraud they would supposedly curb. One of the most popular images simply juxtaposed the two numbers side by side, communicating the out-of-proportion disparity between the suggested remedy and the real issue. Political pundits on both sides observed that the exchange had changed the terms of the voting rights conversation. What Representative Crockett had done was not partisan scoring points, but a basic realignment of the discussion to focus on documented facts instead of unsubstantiated principles, wrote one right-wing columnist, adding that true election security depended on responding to actual threats, not hypothetical ones. Progressive pundits also turned their attention to how the particular evidence offered made it increasingly difficult to write off concerns regarding voting obstacles as nothing more than partisan. Once the conversation turns from ideology into concrete instances, such as Mrs. Johnson's 7-month battle to retain her right to vote, it becomes far more challenging to define such concerns as artificial or overstated, considered an MSNBC contributor. Most importantly, polling done in the weeks after the hearing indicated a quantifiable change in the way people thought. The Pew Research Center found that the number of Americans who thought voter fraud was prevalent decreased by 7 points, while 9 points more said they were concerned that qualified voters being blocked. These changes cut across party lines, indicating that particular evidence in front of them had broken out of the usual political bubble. For Crockett, this effect went beyond this one hearing. Her office saw a sharp surge of demands for the information she had provided, both from media and from state legislators examining voter reform bills and civic organizations working on voter access. Multiple law schools contacted her to ask included in talks about evidence-based solutions to election law. Voting rights groups responded most critically. Instead of basking in the glow of a political win, many groups started using Crockett's evidence-based model in their own, targeting specific documented obstacles rather than broad principles. This change of tack was successful in mobilizing voters who might otherwise have written off issues regarding voting access as partisan rhetoric. For Bondi, the aftermath was multifaceted but ultimately positive. While some hardline comments attacked her for compromising on voter ID requirements, others welcomed her willingness to discuss seriously with contrary evidence. In a Fox News interview a fortnight after the hearing, Bondi elaborated on her refined view. "My biggest concern always has been election integrity," she said, "but integrity demands both security and accessibility." The evidence Congresswoman Crockett laid out regarding the low rate of in-person fraud in relation to the number of eligible voters who may be disenfranchised by strict ID laws indicates we rebalance our strategy. She went on, "That is not to say that we must eliminate ID requirements altogether, but it does mean we must make sure such requirements don't accidentally disenfranchise eligible voters. There are solutions that can do both. Streamlined procedures for free government ID, wider acceptance of non-photo identification with proper authentication, and more relaxed provisional voting practice." This more subtle stance allowed for a more constructive discussion regarding possible compromises that satisfy both security and accessibility. Several state legislators cited the Crockett-Bondi exchange when introducing bills that would strengthen identification requirements while removing documented barriers to obtaining necessary ID. 6 months after the hearing, the impact continued to resonate in concrete policy changes. 3 states with particularly strict ID laws implemented reforms to their free voter ID program, expanding access points and simplifying documentation requirements. These were specifically associated with the facts heard at the hearing, with one state's legislation actually being named the Voting Access Security Balance. News media coverage of voting rights matters also improved, with the major shifting away from general debates on fraud versus oppression to more subtle coverage of particular obstacles and remedies. Some leading reporters established specialized covering the actual application of voting laws, as opposed to the political showmanship around. Most important, the exchange provided an opening for bipartisan dialogue on an issue that had once polarized. A bipartisan working election was created to draft best practice for balanced security and accessibility, with the Crockett-Bondi mention as illustrating potential for evidence-based method that cut across partisan. A year later, one political scientist encapsulated the Crockett-Bondi confrontation as an unusual moment in which specific evidence penetrated partisan framing by pointing to documented facts instead of abstract ideology. Representative Crockett made room for dialogue grounded in common facts instead of rival narrative. The outcome wasn't, but perhaps something more a model for talking about voting rights that recognizes both security, accessibility, and anchors that conversation empirically verifiable evidence. So if this tale caused you to reflect on the power of a shift, on the value of looking at recorded realities of abstract, or on the possibilities for real and beyond political divide, subscribe here. We'll keep explaining the moment that breakthrough party frame for something ever less in our politics. Discussions based on facts, respect for each other's legitimate grievances. Because, as Jasmine Crockett so obliged in her debate with Pam Bondi, the strongest political claims aren't ideological at all. They're about shining a light on hidden realities where they can no longer be marginalized.